Greetings all! Time for another Q&A where I get to respond to the occasionally weird questions you guys put to me. Mainly from Patreons, but I do take the occasional interesting ones from other sources as well, such as YouTube comments on previous Q&As, if I think they're good enough. I'm going to kick off this time with Thunderchild. You have been made producer of The Grand Tour and are helping the guys choose tanks for a special. What would you recommend for each? Actually, we took a look into that over at World of Tanks. Obviously, we wanted to have our ducks in a row before approaching the boys well, back then it was still Top Gear. So we in the American office had to think about it and did some research. We figured that even if they didn't want to partake, we could have some fun on our own with the various military folks that we had in the company. So I would take an American tank. You would have Challenger, my UK counterpart over in World of Tanks Europe, take a British tank, and we were kicking around maybe somebody like Yuri Pashlok for the Russian tank. So for example, Sherman T-34 Churchill or M60 Chieftain T-72. The problem we had was in finding not just 3 operational vehicles physically close enough together to actually film them, but in finding some whose owners would really let us throw them around a bit for the various challenges. Let's face it, most operating tank owners try not to put too much stress on their vehicles, for obvious reasons. If they break, they are difficult and expensive to repair. Even acknowledging that we could shoot and edit things to make them a little bit more dynamic perhaps than they really were, we decided it just wasn't feasible, so we never did attempt to reach out. As an aside, it appears that James May is a fan of the Tank Museum in Bovington. When you call their telephone number, he's the voice on the answering machine. Unfortunately, he just says, "James here." So when I asked the staff at Bovington who the hell James was, they were a little bit put out. I mean, British accent, name of James, how am I supposed to know? Also, what are my thoughts on Saracen and Saladin? I've not had many yet really. As far as I know, they seemed pretty good vehicles for the time, but they were definitely of an older generation. Obviously I've seen them in museums, but I've never really given them a solid going over or mechanical investigation. I am sure I will get there sometime. There are still a few out there. Alexander H. For Gun of the Month, can I show you the AK-74? Okay, I was going to get to it eventually anyway. A little bit earlier, but this is an AK-74 manufactured by Molot, I believe it is the Vepr AK-74. And I got it mainly because it was a collector's piece. I mean, you can't be a firearm enthusiast not own an AK, but I wanted the 74 over the 47. I think that was a good call. This is actually a lot of fun to shoot. Not much recoil, it's actually very smooth. It does have questionable design decisions. So for example, you have a leaf sight with a notch, a blade sight. Yeah, whatever you want to call it. Suffice to say, you can adjust for range and it's just a little notch, just like a pistol that works with the front sight post. And you can see the sight radius is only halfway. So I mean, it's like carbine length sight radius. I have acquired, as you can see, a red dot sight, which you will note mounts sort of on the left eye. So I don't know if I just accidentally purchased a left-eyed sight. I mean, I got it from a bloke in the office who happened to have, I mean, it's Russian markings and all, so whatever. So I'm in two minds about this one. I haven't actually tried shooting with this since I got it. It is a little bit odd to be on the left eye instead of directly on top of the sight. Yeah, the fixed sight. But you got to admit, it doesn't get in the way of the fixed sight either. I'm told, not that I'm an expert in Veprs, that this is one of the better forms of AK, and it uses a lot of RPK style parts, which makes them a little bit more heavy duty. This was one of the firearms that I purchased in California, and at the time it had to be California legal, which meant that I had a little block on the mag release. And like all most of my other California legal rifles, the Tavor being the exception, it took all of about 30 seconds to change from California legal to evil, quote, assault weapon, unquote. But I have to say, I think this was a pretty fun purchase. I mean, I'm talking about crude. I mean, look at the safety catch here. But this is a fun little plinker, I have to say. So I'll put that back down and get back on to the other questions. And I'm going to continue on with the Slavin. Of all the tanks you've reviewed, which was the one you enjoyed reviewing the most and why? It's like asking which of my children is my favorite. That said, I think I'm going to go with the STRV-103 for 3 reasons. Firstly, there was a lot of information already available, and also, if I didn't have the answer pre-researched, well, the museum director, Stefan, was always close to hand to fill me in. And he was a tanker. The more I know about a vehicle, the more fun I have in talking about it. I enjoy getting into the weeds and simply knowing what all the buttons do, even the obscure ones. Secondly, they're just so different to everything else, and a variety is nice. Thirdly, Stefan let me drive the thing, and if you watch the video, I have this great big grin on my face as the turbine spools up. Nostalgia. The other thing I like about doing a tank review is actually nothing to do with the vehicle at all. There are some reviews I've done where the staff are just plain supportive, knowledgeable, and fun to be around. They are rarely seen on screen, and in fact, oftentimes I will get so distracted in conversation or side items that it kind of eats into my filming time. You don't see it because I don't press record. But I do gladly accept the delay, and I'm happy to say that I'm greeted with a friendly face in all sorts of musea all over the world. So folks like Rob, Jeremy, Jason, Joel, or Ralph also, as well as Stefan, have been great with trusting me with their vehicles, answering my questions, swapping war stories, and doing some scut work from, crap, can you find me a thing to, I need an impromptu cameraman. Would you hold the camera? So with the STRV-103, I had this magic confluence of a fascinatingly unique vehicle, the knowledge of the vehicle, a running vehicle that they'd let me drive, and a friendly, accommodating, and helpful staff. Oh, and good weather. White Sagittarius. If the Netherlands had been more up to standard at the beginning of World War II, whose tanks might they have bought? Statistically, probably British, simply because that was what most countries were going with. Maybe with Sweden being an alternative, and they did buy Swedish armoured cars after all. But if you look at who was selling tanks for export at the time though, it's a pretty small list. France, which the Belgians went with, UK, Czechoslovakia, Sweden, sort of. Even the US, you think, big arms exporter, they weren't really in the export game, not for armour. Marmor Harrington and Christie notwithstanding. Now, that's not to say that Italy or Hungary or whoever wouldn't sell their tanks if asked, but were they good enough to buy compared to the major export powers? Sworn brother of the Ballistic Order of St. John Moses Browning. I've heard from 2 camps regarding the Desert Storm Ground War as it relates to the dreaded 1980s Fulda Gap matchup. One school of thought says that the Iraqis followed Soviet armor doctrine to the letter, trained their crews expertly from the Soviet curriculum, and got hammered, indicating that the Red Army would have been wasted in the face of superior US/NATO tanks, weapons, etc., and their only hope of winning would be through sheer numbers. The other camp says that while the Iraqis may have officially followed Soviet doctrine, their T-72s are export models, downgraded, they bought cheap ammo with reduced penetration capability, their training was oriented towards looking cool in their tanks in Baghdad parades, the Iraqi Air Force was a no-show, whereas the Soviet Air Force would be a major player, and therefore they should not be considered representative of how the Red Army would have performed had the balloon gone up in Germany. It makes you wonder sometimes, why is it called a balloon? I'm sure there's a history to that idiom, but anyway. I figure the truth is somewhere in between. Can you shed some light on the subject? Well, both groups are full of crap. It doesn't take much assessment to note that whatever doctrine the Iraqis were using, it certainly wasn't Soviet. However, your second group is somewhat closer to the truth with regards to the Air Force and the quality of the tank ammunition. Remember also that unlike a lot of armies in countries led by strongmen, the Iraqi army was intended to fight, not just look good in parade. I mean, it had just finished 8 years of war with Iran. However, it turns out that your question has already been directly addressed by an article by Michael Eisenstadt and Kenneth Pollack entitled, Armies of Snow and Armies of Sand, the Impact of Soviet Military Doctrine on Arab Militaries, found in the Middle East Journal of Autumn 2001. In the case studies, they look at the major Arab combatants in the post-war era, and the Iraqis are the least Soviet in doctrine of any of them. In fact, their doctrine was fundamentally British, modified by the reality that they did not have the training or culture to rely on initiative in the same manner. As a result, Iraq, like the other Arab countries, developed a form of Arab doctrine better suited to their forces, implemented that in their 8-year war. Even though the Air Force and air defense were the most Soviet-influenced, many of the Iraqi pilots had been trained in the US, UK and France and were expected to use a lot more personal initiative in their combat. To quote from the article, "In the cases considered here, there is no apparent correlation between the extent of Soviet military advisory presence in an Arab country, or its reliance on Soviet equipment, and the degree to which that country's military adopted Soviet organizational forms, concepts, or practices." In any case, it's a long article. The bottom line here is that basically nothing about the Fulda Gap could be extrapolated from the 1991 war. Hammer of Terror. Why have modern AFVs almost all moved to a track system utilizing return rollers? Actually, I've not seen any documentation on that, believe it or not. There is a notable exception in the return roller camp, and that's a CV90, which is still unsupported. Most every other high-speed vehicle, however, uses return rollers. It's probably simply to do with ensuring that the road wheels, as they bounce up and down, don't hit the track return, especially if it is a wide and thus heavy track. They also want to make sure that if you have large or armoured side skirts, the track return is kept clear of the support arms for the side skirts, which could be very ugly even with just a light contact. Even the CV90 though, you'll see has a relatively raised track in terms of the gap between the road wheel and the track, which of course would raise even higher with the tension caused by the sprocket dragging it forward. Even unsupported track needs to be tensioned though. Don't mistake the fact that the track is unsupported with the thought that the tension on the idler and sprocket are much less. It just looks less because you have a larger sag. I'm sure somebody will now chime in with a technical answer, but for now, I think not interfering with the road wheels or skirt support arms is probably going to do. Oscar, what is my most favorite Swedish tank and why? What is with the Swedish questions today? S-Tank, see aforementioned turbine comment, but I do appreciate the pragmatic, out-of-the-box thinking behind it. I think an honorary mention needs to be given to the L60 though. It was a thoroughly good design for the time. Caleb Engelhardt, how do I decide what vehicle and which presently surviving example will be in an Inside the Chieftain's hatch? Have I ever had to scrap an episode that had progressed somewhere into production? The only one I've ever scrapped was the T-34-76. It was the very, very first one filmed, and the quality was simply not releasable. Sharp-eyed viewers will see some snippets from that sequence in some of the earlier episode title sequences. These days, there are several criteria. Firstly, well, how much does it cost? Not just filming fees, if any, and some musea can be quite high, which is why I've not gone to them, but getting there and staying in the area for a few days as well also costs money. This can also be modified by the number of vehicles present. So for example, the owner of the most recently produced surviving Sherman, and it's something like last but number 36 off of the line, asks if I am interested in swinging up his place to cover it. Absolutely, I've not done a 76mm Sherman yet, and his does seem to be in great condition. Unfortunately, it's also the only tank up his part of the country that I know of, which makes it simply cost impractical for now to fly all the way up for just the one tank. The TKS was a target of opportunity. I just happened to be in the area for other reasons. Then I have to debate if it's a tank which World of Tanks is interested in. If so, then I'm going to wait for it to be covered by them. They are my full-time employer after all, and they have started to support the series again. If not, then it is something that I will do with Patreon funding, which actually gives me much more choice. I actually do prefer the Cold War stuff personally, which is why the current batch of videos coming out of my recent Fort Benning trip involves vehicles which do not appear in World of Tanks. You've already seen the XM808 and the M51 recovery vehicle, and there are 2 more to follow. So no T28 yet, sorry. The XM808 is also an example of a vehicle which kind of fell into my lap. I was digging in the archives and I found out quite a bit of information about it. It's kind of a cool vehicle and I was interested in it. So why not put it near the front of the list? The next criterion is the quality of the vehicle. As much as possible, I'm holding out on certain vehicles until I can find the one which is as close as possible to intact inside as well as outside. If I can drive, or better yet, shoot the thing, hey, this is America after all, I'll hold off until a suitable opportunity. There are a couple of vehicles which meet that category right now. And then, of course, it all comes down to a balance. I'll spend more money traveling to a place which has more quality vehicles or a particularly unique vehicle. It's not purely a matter of where is affordable. I mentioned before that I had a trip to Brazil scheduled before COVID. It's not cheap and I don't expect that the vehicles are going to be in great condition, but I do expect that they will be fascinating, rare and worth covering. Finally, of course, is just responding to demand. One large European collection, to which I have not yet been, has outright asked me to go visit and film there. Although there are other musea in Europe I need to go back to, who am I to say no to a request, especially if it has a number of vehicles that I have not yet covered? Mike Quinton, looking at a Stryker SHORAD vehicle, if it only has 4 shots with the Stinger and 2 with the Hellfire, how easy will it be for a pair of these vehicles to be overwhelmed? Is it the expectation that a battalion or brigade will be attacked by only 6 aircraft at a time? Well, it seems to me that if 10 aircraft start attacking and 6 blow up, the other 4 very well may start being very circumspect. Remember, air defense does not require air destruction. That said, SHORAD is basically the last line of defense. Whatever's attacking the brigade has got to get through the US Air Force first, and I suspect some spare Stingers are also carried around. That said, there are rumblings that man-pad Stingers will be making a return. Josh Conti, can I make an episode about M36 Jacksons in Korea? I'm curious to find out how they were used in conflict and if they were tank destroyers or medium tanks. Josh, I think it was the most recent Q&A, if not the one before. They were categorized by the Koreans as tanks. That said, I don't know if I have actually seen much about the M36 usage. I suspect any documentation on the matter will be in Korean, which I cannot read and I don't really have access to anyway. John Zabala, what is my opinion on the M4A2E4 and why wasn't it fielded? Right, for those of you who aren't tracking, the M4A2E4 was an attempt to fit torsion bars to a Sherman. They were full width bars, they provided a 26-inch wheels with a 7-inch range of movement. Overall, the vehicle came out as about the same weight as the standard bogie-equipped M4. On the plus side, the vehicle seemed to have less rolling resistance and gave a better ride on the cross-country course, mainly due to the larger range of wheel motion, meaning it was less likely to bottom out and transmit jolts to the crew compartment. On the downside, for whatever reason, it had more vibration than any tank tested against it, which included VVSS and HVSS Shermans and T-20E3. Now, of interest, the T-20E3, which also had torsion bars, gave the least vibration of the lot. So the difference apparently wasn't so much in the suspension type as much as the strength of the suspension. As the M4A2E4 was 3 tons heavier than the T-20E3, it required stiffer bars. The Belgian block course saw the VVSS as the most stable, and on the washboard, the 2 bogie Shermans stayed more or less level and just bounced up and down, whilst the torsion bar tanks saw the front stay more or less level and the rear pitched up and down, causing a very unstable ride, although the test officer felt that the stabilizer of the gun could probably counteract most of it. In the end though, it came down to logistics. The report concluded that torsion bars should certainly be pursued, but on other tanks. It was considered simply not worth the hassle of building torsion bar Shermans to serve alongside bogie Shermans. The actual verbiage was, quote, release of production of the medium tank M4E4 would involve considerable maintenance problems without improving on the value of the medium tank M4 as a weapon. Or in other words, right suspension system, wrong tank at the wrong time. Adam Schindler, is it easier to work with infantry as an organic or as a divisional corps level asset? Or is that a pointless distinction in combat? Of course, in combat, you'd tend to run in company teams. You'd cross-level a tank platoon to an infantry company, which itself sends an infantry platoon to the tank company. So every little miniature combined arms teams. The units themselves would be organizationally pure. It simply makes training easier. The entire company, or battalion, whatever level this homogeneous unit is, could do a tank gunnery at once, for example, without having to worry about supporting the guys in the AFVs. This means then that generally speaking, you don't really know the guys wearing blue, as you can just end up getting whatever platoon gets assigned to you for the exercise or the operation. In World War II, if you read Yides' The Infantry's Armour, you will see repeated reference to how they tried to keep one infantry tank battalion assigned to one division for a while, so that they would start to get to know each other. And the same would presumably happen at lower levels if that is your level of integration. However, I think it all comes down to training opportunities. So January of 2005, we were attached to 124 Infantry, a Stryker unit. As soon as we arrived, we held some brief familiarization courses for the infantry because they were in a Stryker brigade, and for all we know, their 11Bs had never been close to a tank before. And since we were going to be working in a city, they needed to know what we could or could not do and where they could or could not stand, that sort of thing. So to answer the question, the answer is that organizationally you want to have infantry and armor mixed at as low a level as you can get away with. Typically this has been battalion. These days, with the evolution of the combined arms battalion, it's company. There have been outliers though, such as some Cav units which had mixed companies by MTO of tanks and M113s. It's just easier to command and train in peacetime a homogeneous unit. Flipped Sherman. Okay. Where do I draw the line between an MBT and a medium tank? Some people claim that the T-55, M48 or Centurion are MBTs, but they served alongside heavy tanks. It's a good question and one which has been argued endlessly by people on and off the internet, and I'm not going to settle it here. I would remind you that in Operation Think Tank, when posed the question of what was the first MBT, the panel of august experts chose not to wade into it, with the exception of Steve Zaloga, who proposed Panther. My personal belief is that the medium tank evolved into the MBT. Note that T-54 was developed as a medium and Centurion was developed as a cruiser, not the universal tank which some in the UK were clamouring for. That would have ended up being a different and failed project. Put simply, I hypothesize that technical development was such that less of a trade-off needed to be made anymore in the Iron Triangle. Guns were improved and lightened in weight. Engines were made more powerful for the size, meaning that armour could be thicker for the same mobility. Basically, without really meaning to, in the attempt to make a better medium or cruiser, the builders simply happened to come up with a vehicle which would have the characteristics of what we would later determine to be an MBT. I don't think there is a hard and fast line between the two when it comes to physical characteristics. I personally would consider Centurion and T-54 both to be MBTs, regardless of their provenance. J. I've mentioned that the 75mm was found lacking in Normandy, while previously in Italy was seen as effective. What circumstances changed between Italy and Normandy which caused the 75mm to be less effective? Nothing. Indeed, if anything, the reverse was actually true. The 76mm tank was released for production in Q4 of 1943. It started rolling off the factories in January. This meant that somewhere in Q1 1944, the major commands in Europe would have been aware that the tank existed.
Daddy.
Yes?
I just sneezed.
You sneezed? Oh no.
That's the thing. I just keep doing.
He has a little carpentry tool set.
I go too fast.
You went to swim class, yes. Did you do a good swimming?
Uh-huh.
Okay, careful with your feet. Okay, go back to mommy, please. I have to keep filming. Thank you. Oh, will you take doggy? The major command in Europe actually doing the fighting at the time was 5th Army, conducting its long slog up the Italian peninsula. That said, it was mainly an infantry fight. Anti-tank issues didn't seem too critical. Major enemy armoured assaults were stopped at Gela or Salerno, and when the Panther was finally encountered in early 1944, one of the very first ones met was knocked out by an M5 light tank, which got around the rear. That said, the restricted terrain did normally mean that when a Panther or Ferdinand was encountered, it was down to frontal shots, which those vehicles were well suited to. 18th of March 1944, 5th Army sent a radio message to the US saying, in effect, "For the love of God, stop sending us 75mm tanks, send us only 76mm tanks and that new T-71 90mm tank destroyer you've been telling us about. In fact, send us so many 76mm tanks that we can replace all of the 75mm tanks that we have. We want to get rid of all the M10s as well." They obviously were not seeing the 75mm as suitable to requirement. Now, they did modify the request a week later, saying, "Actually, we'll keep the M10s while we wait and see if this T-71 is actually any good, but we don't want the T-70s, the Hellcats." But their opinion on the tanks, though, remained the same. Dog, other way, turn around. Turn around, dog. Okay, well, just don't leave it too loud. What?
You're sure we're okay while you're filming?
We'll see how loud it is.
Dog.
So, put him in the camera. So there's this thing on the internet, I guess. You mentioned dog, you must show dog. I don't get it.
What do you mean?
I don't know. I don't get it. It's just a thing.
To show what?
If you mention the dog, you have to show the dog. That's apparently an internet rule.
You want to see the dog?
They want to see the dog. That's the wife's dog. I have nothing to do with it, or little as possible to do with it. The joys of filming with a family. And no, I don't have doors on the office either. It's on my to-do list. Anyway, it seems that there was no crosstalk on the matter between the lads in Italy and the lads in the UK waiting to go to Normandy. And it also seems that the lads in DC didn't think to forward such an observation to the UK either. As far as the guys in the UK were concerned, the 75mm armed army were still doing the job. They were hearing nothing to say that it was worth the hassle of bringing along those 76mm tanks which had just arrived. And thus, they only realised in Normandy that, actually, it probably was worth the hassle of bringing them along. Oh, and also, would you mind awfully inventing HVAP ammo, please? However, that didn't mean that the 75mm was universally unpopular either. Shortly after Araucourt, that battle where the US forces with only 75mm Shermans and some TDs trounced the Panther unit, they refused any 76mm tanks, being quite happy with the 75. Abrams basically had to be ordered to swap to a 76mm to set an example for his men. Interestingly, after using the 76mm tank for a short while, they became converts. Similarly, 6th Armoured Division reported on 14th of October, quote, "We have received no 76mm tanks and have no great desire for them. We'll take more 105 tanks though." By late October, the 712th Tank Battalion had no particular opinion on the 76mm gun simply because it hadn't yet found anything to shoot at with it. This matches up with another report I've seen in the archives where Ordnance Branch were complaining that they didn't have any data on the real-world performance of a new AP round because no enemy tanks had been found to get battle results from.
Mom, Daddy, I got M&M.
Hooray! The reality was that they were simply not a particularly common target. So, a short answer to the question. It all came down to the type of fighting you were involved with. I've mentioned before that if you were in Italy or northern France, you preferred the M10 as a tank destroyer. If you were in southern or central France, the M18. The type of fighting you were involved with tended to determine your wants. Normandy was a brutal slugfest. Folks wanted bigger guns. Once the race across France had begun, the 75mm was fantastic. Then you hit the West Wall. By December, 6th Armoured had changed its tune. It now desired 76mm guns, but it said that this was because many of the targets that they would encounter would be concrete or steel fortifications. George Paramore, is there any proof of enemy tank or gun features being basically copied by any nation? Jerry cans come to mind, and boiling vessels. I must admit to not being aware of anything copied bolt for bolt, as it were, but it was standard practice to take a look at either an enemy or allied tank and take it apart to see whether it had any concepts worth incorporating into your own production. Basically, ooh, that's a neat feature. Let Bob over in the design office know about it. So for example, I seem to recall reading that it was basically the reaction the Soviets had to the M4's stabilizer and the commander's vision cupola found on the later M4s. One looks at the wet stowage on Shermans and Chaffees and wonders if the wet stowage on Chieftain was just convergent evolution or if they simply said, well, that's a good idea, we'll nick it. This is of course separate to tanks, which are basically licensed or unlicensed copies or derivatives of other tanks as a whole. So for example, there are quite a few tanks in the interwar period where one looks at the Vickers 6-ton, then one looks at the whatever and goes, hang on a minute, that looks suspiciously familiar. The Carden Lloyd tankette was the same way, progenitor of anything from the TKS to the CV-33, though I don't believe they ever received royalties for them. Robert Naborny, no, I have no information on the Mobile Protected Firepower program. I've not noticed any press releases or test reports come across my desk. I strongly suspect that the latter are classified. But I don't think that Griffin's being based on Ajax is all that problematic. It has a sufficiently modified hull. I doubt the vibration problems will be the same as the British were having. B7. Any fun or memorable glitches in tank software I can think of? No. Remember, I'm a previous generation tanker. I was in M1A1s and M3A2s. I don't think they had software. Not that I've ever delved into it, but I have a very strong suspicion that they had firmware instead. And if you wanted to install a new version of whatever reason, let's say an ammo type, you needed to swap out cards. The only exception would have been with the Blue Force Tracker, which I vaguely recall ran on OS 2. I seem to recall that the system was so clunky that much of the capabilities I never used. I mean, I never could get into the idea of trying to type in contact information instead of just shooting at it and making the contact no longer relevant or concern. At most, I'd just radio it in, it's a lot faster, and then somebody sitting at a desk could do the grunt work. In fact, I also seem to recall that a lot of the logistical capabilities of the system were never used by anyone either. Felicity Longus, what can you tell me about tank destroyer doctrines outside of the US Army? From my understanding, the Germans seem to take a more offensive approach to the matter, seeking out enemy armor rather than being used to blunt enemy armored offensives. The Soviets seem to consider all their TDs to be assault guns, even when more specialized for the role, such as the Su-85. The British assigned their TDs to artillery units, treating them as towed guns that happened to be able to move themselves. Well, you kind of answered your own question. The British did treat their vehicles as self-propelled anti-tank guns. I'll put a link in the description below, but there's a chap by the name of Nigel Evans who's put up a fairly reasonable overview on British anti-tank gun doctrine. In Armoured Champion, Zaloga mentions that, quote, the only dedicated tank destroyer the Soviets had was the Su-85. Though as that was for the chapter for 1944, maybe that was just because the Su-100 wasn't around yet. I did ask Yuri Pashalok. His response, on the other hand, was that the Su-85 was considered a, quote, universal self-propelled gun, and was used in all roles. The Germans are quite interesting. German doctrine for tank destroyers was actually identical to what the US implemented, at least until the middle of the war, only one level down. Where US doctrine officially stated that TDs should be used in battalions and occasionally companies, the German thinking was that Panzerjägers would be used in companies and occasionally platoons. But otherwise it was the same, down to commentary that not having a roof would allow the Panzerjägers to see first and shoot first. Of course, much like with self-propelled artillery, the Germans didn't actually have the production capacity to spare for purpose-built vehicles. In the end, only 2 Panzer were built. These are fast half-tracks with a 7.5cm gun in an open-topped turret. Panzerjäger 1 was of course just a reuse of old chassis. Only when you get to Marder do you start to see at least something close to a mass production of a vehicle suited to task. After that, you start to see doctrine take a bit of a backseat to other matters. Jagdpanzer IV wasn't supposed to be a tank destroyer at all. It was developed to be the Stug 4, but became the subject of a fight between Panzerbranch, in reality Guderian, who had no time for Stugs at all, and the infantry and artillery branches who liked Stugs. Guderian won, it became designated the Jagdpanzer and thus fell under his control as panzer troop. Remember, Guderian felt that Germany's limited AFV production needed to be given to the panzer units as the main offensive maneuver unit of the army. When combined with the fact that there weren't enough panzers of any sort, the vehicle was occasionally used as a surrogate tank, no matter what the anti-tank doctrine would have been. Such also was going to prove to be the case with the Jagdpanther, the Spielberger book on heavy Jagdpanzers noting the displeasure an inspecting officer had of Jagdpanthers being used in the role of assault guns in offensive operations. I also recall Hilary Doyle stating fairly specifically that Jagdpanzer 38T was considered a self-propelled anti-tank gun and was basically just better than pushing a Pak 40 through the mud. And of course, any project whose design started after about 1940 is going to be a little bit askew because of the influences of certain political figures who thought that more armour and bigger guns were always going to be better, no matter what the history of the first 2 years of the war may have shown. Andrew Sebastian. Some modern AFVs have been designed without traditional direct optics, instead using cameras connected to monitors with either traditional wiring or fibre optics. Have any of these designs actually entered service? And do I have any experience to make comparisons between traditional optics and cameras? Obviously, the main problem with a traditional direct optic is that it requires that a hole be placed in the armour for that optic. Not only is the hole itself an obvious weak point, small as it is, but there's also something called edge effect, which makes armour around the hole weaker as well. The idea of using a camera instead of a traditional optic is that you can route the wire to, say, the roof, where a hole is much less of a problem. It's not that you can't run a traditional optic through the roof, of course, that's what doghouses are, and for some auxiliary sites such as Challenger, they'll go the same way as well. But if you're in a modern tank which already has screens for other things, why not just use the same screen for the camera site? Either way, it seems that the way vehicle designers are going recently is that they're hedging their bets. They're retaining a traditional daylight optic with the thermal imager, which of course must use a screen of some sort, and using a camera as the backup site. One advantage for using a camera particularly applies in the case of IFVs, as a repeater monitor can be placed in the troop compartment, thus the troops get a good look at what's in front of the vehicle before the ramp drops. Or alternatively, if the driver, say, is doing nothing better at the time, he can tune his monitor to monitor the camera, whilst the gunner is looking through a different sight, that sort of thing. Of course, the argument against is that the backup site is supposed to be for when everything has gone wrong and you may not have any power. In such cases, oftentimes vehicles will have separate circuits and batteries dedicated just to important functions which can be turned on for an hour or two, so it's actually not as terrible an idea as you may think. I suspect it'll be a very long time though before any tanks are fielded with purely electronic optics, unless there is some physical reason preventing traditional optic use, such as on unmanned turrets. John Kettner. Had Sherman Firefly been based off the bigger turret Sherman, would it have been more effective, or should the Commonwealth have just adopted the 76mm? The UK had a very good reason for preferring the 17 pounder over the 76. They already had the gun in their system. They were building the ammunition for it. It was a good anti-tank gun. Where is the main advantage to them for keeping the 76mm? The question for them wasn't 76mm or 17 pounder. The question was, what do we shove the 17 pounder into? And that was a problem that they wrestled with for quite a while. The requirement was always to receive 75mm turrets. Now, I've not seen anything specific on the British side as to why, but I suspect from reading in between the lines of an experiment which the US did in putting a 75mm into a 76mm turret, that it may simply not have fit correctly. It's not just a matter of how big the turret is, but also where the components are inside it. The 76mm turret's trunnions were a little bit further forward compared to the 75mm turret, which altered the positioning of everything behind the mantlet relative to the turret ring. It's entirely possible that some component of the recoil system or the elevation system simply wouldn't be able to fit or have the right clearance in the T-23 turret. I personally still think that we'd been better off using M10s. Admiral Tiberius. In my last tank video with Ian, I mentioned that the Soviet 115mm was never really developed as it could have been. Could I explain further? T-62 was something of an interim tank, which kind of sounds a little bit odd when one considers just how many vehicles were made. But then again, look at the M3 medium or the M10 tank destroyer, which are also interims. A lot of the Soviet leadership's attention was being focused on Object 432, which would eventually become T-64. However, it was suffering from significant teething troubles, and nobody was interested in putting all the eggs into the T-64 basket. Eventually, of course, the T-72 would come along as well, and eventually between the two of them, they would push T-62 out of frontline service, at least against NATO tanks. All the development effort then went into the 125mm. The T-62 went to secondary areas where the ammunition it had was quite acceptable, or to export customers, where the ammunition it had was good enough for export. Now, that's not to say that there were no upgrades at all. Improvements in ammunition arrived in the 3BM-21 of 1977 and 3BM-28 in 1982, and the BM-36 of 1988, which was depleted uranium, and I don't believe exported. But if you think about it, even that's over 3 decades without a new round. Nearly 4, if you look at the export ammunition only. Compare with, for example, the contemporary British 105mm, which was still seeing ammunition developed as recently as a decade ago. The Russians simply put their efforts into the 125mm, leaving any possibility for improvements in T-62 ammunition design to aftermarket manufacturers. Kazuki K. Vehicles like the T-55E1 were unsuited for the needs of World War II, but considering the much more urbanized nature of warfare today, could there be a niche for a vehicle that's wheeled and armed with a primary armament much more geared towards infantry support, especially for a military which isn't first rate? It will be easier to maintain and manufacture, cheaper and easier to cross-train drivers in. Or does the modern tracked IFV cover that need already? I'd say more the latter. I have 3 issues with the idea of a wheeled vehicle in urban combat. The first is the amount of 3-point turns that it'd have to do to get down half of the streets. Most country cities are not quite as open as North American ones after all. The second is that if there is particularly serious combat, I would expect there to be a lot of debris to include concrete rubble and rebar to be in those streets, which I don't think would do great things to a wheeled vehicle. Thirdly, it seems to me that if there is any scenario where you would want as heavy a vehicle as possible, and thus tracks, it would be in a town with armor on the sides, top and bottom. Also, an issue that does not mesh well with wheeled vehicles. Of course, immediately one must look at Singapore, which is mainly city, and note that they are buying 450 Terex 8x8 vehicles, but on the other hand, it also has over 800 Bionics IFVs. So they seem to be going more for the tracks. On the subject of T-55E1, any plans on a video about weird wheeled prototypes and the US's history of testing and developing wheeled tank destroyer type vehicles up to the 1128? Not specifically on that subject, no, but I will hit a few as targets in the standard run of things. Witness the recent XM808 video. You've mentioned on many occasions about the sheer rawness of vibrations and concussion in tanks. Has there ever been any research or testing conducted on the use of powerboat-style hydraulic damping seats? Not that I'm aware of. I'm sure it's been looked at for shock protection for blasts, but I can imagine it would be rather irritating trying to keep your eye to an eyepiece when your seat keeps moving up and down relative to the optics because of the internal suspension feature. Or trying to aim precisely with the control handle would also be a problem when your shoulders keep bouncing around relative to the handle. Indeed, M1 gunners basically get clamped into position between the chest and back rests to try to keep them from moving. It seems to me that the ideal is a sort of a break point. For normal movement, the seat remains completely fixed, but if there's the massive shock of a blast, then the seat will move. Next, from Trevor Long, who served in the Australian Army as CO of a unit which had the M113A1 with the T50 turret with the coaxial caliber 50 and caliber 30 machine guns. He says caliber 30, I thought it would be 7.62. And TLC with M113A1s with Scorpion turrets with 76mm guns. He would appreciate it if I could do an article on both of these vehicles. Well, the MRV very well may be doable. I know there are some of the earlier FSVs with the Saladin turret in Musea. I've not seen the Scorpion version. If you know where one is which is accessible and intact, write in the comments below. I've not seen the APC version, and I don't know how many weren't converted to the AS4. So probably not as long an answer as you're looking for, but as I say, if I come across one, I'll be sure to give it a look because they are unique. Matt Lesich, I recently discovered the Big Wind, which is a T-34 tank with the turret removed and replaced with twin jet engines from a MiG-21 used to put out oil well fires after the Gulf War. Have I come across any other interesting or unusual tank conversions? Well, frankly, if you can imagine a conversion, it's probably already been done. However, watch for a video that I appear on another channel soon. S-Face. Does any army have a doctrine to deal with a mass technical assault? Is it different to an assault by other vehicles? I can only think of two differences. Firstly, confirmation that the vehicles coming towards you are in fact technicals and not civilians. If they're shooting at you with heavy machine guns as they charge, that simplifies your process. The other difference is that they are likely to be far more vulnerable to 7.62 and 5.56mm fire than the typical armoured vehicle, so there is no need for specialist equipment. Alex 862. Is the US still considering the XM360E1 to fit onto the M1? As far as I know, no. The gun has two major improvements on the M256. It has a higher chamber pressure, meaning it can fire ammunition with more power, and it is about a ton lighter with better recoil management. It seems to me that the Army would be more interested in the second two features, as apparently it would mean that a 20-ton vehicle could take the weight. Remember, it was developed as part of the now cancelled Future Ground Combat Vehicle, which was supposed to be much lighter than the M1. However, it would appear that there is considered no significant benefit to refitting the M1 with this gun. Presumably, the Army believes that the current gun with current ammunition is capable of handling anything it meets, and saving 1 ton on what is now basically a 70-ton vehicle probably isn't worth the money. As far as I know, not that TACOM CCs me on updates, all work on the gun has stopped. Joe Powell. The British Army have decided a Challenger 3 is a bit naff as tank names go. For the Americans, naff means disappointing, unfashionable, or tacky. Sensing a good chance for some publicity, they reach out to a popular tank-themed YouTuber to choose a name. As tradition dictates, the name must begin with the letter C and not have been used by Britain before. What name or names do you suggest? Well, the better ask quickly, because I think Cone of Arc is about to overtake me in subscribers. Okay, good C names for a British tank. Constitution, Consolation, Congress, Chesapeake, Concord, Champlain, Chippewa, Chisholm, Clontibret, Collooney, Carricknagat, Clonmel, Cartagena de las Indias, Colenso, Kilt, Chrysler. In Operation Think Tank, David Fletcher pointed out that they suggested Caerphillies as the name for what would become Challenger. It's an impressive castle in South Wales, although I grant it doesn't exactly strike fear into the hearts of the enemy when you say it. You can imagine some foreign soldiers screaming, "Oh my God, the British are coming and they brought their Caerphillies!" Even if it wasn't against the rules to reuse, I can't imagine that Crusader would be politically acceptable, no matter how fearsome it may be. Callous? Collector of souls? I guess there's something to be said for Cyclops, but they might have missed their chance on that one now that they're putting a second sight commander's optic on the top of it. Cupid, you have fin ammo, it's basically big arrows. Culverin, Charger, the horse, not the General Lee. I think I'll go with Caron though, the guy who transported folks from the world of the living to the world of the dead. I'm actually a little bit surprised that hasn't been used yet, actually. Ed, are you aware of any such proposals? Reichsbeer Minister. What were the most useful / best changes / adaptions in tank design that I've come across to improve the quality of life in a tank? Are there any improvements you're wondering why they weren't implemented? Step holes in the side skirting of British tanks like Centurion. The water heater. Drinking water tanks. Heaters and air conditioning. Refrigerators. The Aussies have those. Automated track tensioning systems. Household power sockets. All in all, it seems that pretty much anything that you can think of has by now been implemented somewhere, just not everywhere. The reason why not is probably related to the cost. I mean, imagine how much it will cost to have a US government contractor fit an Australian-style refrigerator to all the M1s in the US Army. Not that I'm cynical or anything. Stefan Weiss. I didn't find anything in the older Q&As. Here's my question. I found some videos of emergency unload training of tanks from train cars by the Soviets and other warpack armies like the NVA, but nothing about that from NATO. Is there any reason why not? I'm thinking two possibilities. One is that NATO simply doesn't think it's going to find a train on the ground assault which requires rapid unloading instead of unloading in its own time. And secondly, it's not exactly a difficult process which requires practice, at least in a NATO tank. All you do is you just neutral steer in place so the tank is pointing off to the flank and then you drive off the side. Easy. The typical Soviet-built tank, however, cannot neutral steer, making getting off the flat car a much more interesting proposition. Brian Koches, or Koches. In World War II, what weapons did the infantry from the various nations have at their disposal to deal with tanks if the infantry didn't have supporting anti-tank guns or their own tanks and can't retreat? Well, the traditional method is to have an anti-tank gun. Now, something to bear in mind is that until the late 1930s, an anti-tank gun means a shoulder-fired bipod rifle, normally somewhere around 13 to 15 millimeters in diameter, such as the Boy's .55. But bigger ones, such as the Lati or the Solothurn 20mm, would also be found. These would be things which could be found distributed around infantry units. Even a heavy machine gun will work nicely. At the larger end of the scale, the Soviets seemed to give everybody who could carry one a PTRD or PTRS, but it is worth observing that unlike the earlier AT guns, these weren't really expected to defeat proper tanks. They could, if they got lucky with a flank shot, but one was more likely to encounter an armoured car or half-track, which an older AT rifle would be quite capable of dealing with. The next option is the rifle grenade, such as the American M9 of 1942. Had about 5 centimeters of penetration, though one must ask whether or not that took into account the fact that a rifle grenade, unless at very, very close range, was unlikely to impact at a perpendicular angle. Satchel and demo charges were always popular. Magnetic mines were a thing for the Germans. You run up, clamp it on, pull the pin and run. Good luck getting that close. At least the Japanese put theirs on the end of a really long stick. But on the other hand, unlike the German magnetic mine, there was no time fuse. Then again, their idea of an anti-tank mine could be dig a big hole that's large enough for a bloke to sit in with an artillery shell and a hammer and wait for the tank to drive on top. Most folks tended to use normal pressure detonated anti-tank mines. One doesn't hear very much about them, but they were extremely effective and rarely available in the numbers desired by the troops. Throwable grenades were also a thing. Most of them, such as sticky bombs or Molotov cocktails, tended to work on an incendiary effect. However, there were some exceptions. The Germans simply bundled a bunch of hand grenades together to make a bigger blast. The RPG-40 also worked on the blast principle, but eventually the RPG-43 and RPG-6 hand grenades came along, which used shaped charges and little drogues to try to keep the thing pointing at the enemy. Another incendiary effect weapon was the Northover projector, which fortunately did not see service for very long. And then you get to the self-propelled stuff, mainly rockets and powder charges, such as Bazooka, Panzerschreck, Panzerfaust, or Piat, all of which seem to use the shaped charge principle. I guess the Blacker Bombard gets a mention as well, but it really counts more as a small anti-tank gun due to its size. So anyway, you get the idea that infantry can be dangerous even without attached anti-tank guns. Charles Charange. Which nation had the best armoured doctrine pre-World War II, and who had the worst? I'm not sure that's an easy question to answer. Each nation had its own requirements for doctrine, and you couldn't look at French doctrine, compare it to German doctrine, and say that it was better or worse. If the French officially had the German doctrine, would that have suited the French situation? There's also the question of the difference between doctrine and the ability to put it into practice. Soviet doctrine was extremely forward-thinking. The only problem was that the vehicles to put it into practice weren't built yet, and the people who understood it tended to get shot. Whatever the pluses and minuses of French doctrine, the command culture in place simply did not permit the doctrine to be followed. And that's quite important. I remember hearing about the Israeli effects-based doctrine from the early 2000s as part of my professional military education, and the fact that one of the major difficulties with the doctrine was that nobody understood it to employ it. Is that a flaw in the doctrine or the teaching of the doctrine? Would the French doctrine have worked in 1940 had the senior officers had any fight in them? The British visitors, the generals, were stunned at the level of resignation and inactivity by the French senior leadership. If they had not waited for written orders instead of working off telephone orders, would the French counterattack at Sedan have failed? Thus, one has to distinguish between doctrines which are impracticable because of their nature in the real world versus not properly conducted because of other issues. I submit the former may be held against the doctrine, but not the latter. USA, what is the difference between a tankette and a light tank or combat car? As far as I can tell, the US did not officially use the term tankette in classifying armoured vehicles. Some sources call the CTLS a Ford 3-ton, or maybe even the M1 combat cars, as tankettes. You are correct, the US did not use the term for its own vehicles. I think the M1918 3-ton will get a pass though, because light tanks hadn't diversified enough to split off into tankettes and lights. However, looking at period documentation, it seems that the US was willing to make the distinction for other nations, referring to things like the Type 92 or Type 97 Japanese tankette versus the Type 93 or Type 95 light tanks. There seems to be no hard line. Cannons or machine guns could be found on both. Turrets on both. What the US refers to as tankettes all had 2-man crews. The light tanks had 3-man crews, but I don't know if that was a dividing line either. It may have been. Otherwise, there's not a hell of a lot in between, say, a Type 97 tankette and a Mark 6 light tank. But a Panzer I wasn't considered a tankette, and that was just a 2-man crew. Thus, it seems to me that the definition seems to revolve around what other vehicles were in the army at the time, or the general whim of the person doing the naming. Ling Tao Li. Hypothetical. Let's say you are a minor nation in the aftermath of World War II and you have acquired a mix of 75 and 76mm armed tanks and tank destroyers from different surplus sales from different nations. Would it be easier to re-gun all the tanks to have the same gun, modify the breeches to all take the same round, or set up a separate ammunition supply line for each gun? So in this case, we're looking at, say, Sherman 75s and 76s, Panzer IVs, Panthers, T-34s, M10s. Obviously, the best solution, as much as possible, is to re-gun everything to the same gun, if you can afford it. This simplifies not only the ammunition problem, but also the maintenance problem. If that can't happen, maybe just the tank can't take the gun, the next simplest thing is rechambering it to take the same ammunition. However, if you have a Panther, you might want to ask if it's truly worth downgrading the gun's ammunition to something which the Panzer IV can also shoot. The most realistic solution is to share projectiles. The US 76mm and 3-inch fired the same projectiles. 17-pounder and 77mm fired the same projectiles. In North Africa, they put German projectiles into US shell casings. 75mm is 75mm after all. You may still have multiple ammunition lines and types to try not to mix up, but at least only one projectile manufacturing line is required. Robert Nabaruni. What's my opinion on the Russian fill-in device? Sounds like it's a problem for tanks and AT weapons. I'd never heard of it, so I looked it up. Quote, the SP-42 fill-in creates a powerful beam of light, similar to the strobe-like effect, preventing enemy soldiers from aiming and targeting protected platforms. Now, using light as a weapon against individuals isn't new. Go back to the canal defense lights of World War II, which strobed in a disorienting manner. A laser dazzle system was deployed to the South Atlantic in 1982 on Royal Navy ships. The idea was to blind incoming pilots, especially those who were flying low and under sea dart. If they were blinded, they might pull up to avoid crashing into the sea, thus giving sea dart a crack. Never actually ended up being used though. Then the Stingray Bradley was deployed in the Gulf War. Again, I don't believe operationally used though. The idea was it scanned around looking for reflections, and when it found one, it gave a pulse of light with the intent of disabling the optical system. Now, most modern optics are filtered so that dangerous laser light is not transmitted to the eyeball. But in that case, I don't see why that shouldn't apply to the electronics as well. So maybe that's why it just never entered widespread service. Either way, the Chinese also have a similar system in service. Sabre 203 was something close to what the film does. It temporarily blinds and disorients folks. It's basically a laser that one shoves into an M203 grenade launcher. The replacement for that is the phaser, the personnel halting and stimulating response rifle, which of course presumably has no rifling at all as it's a handheld laser weapon. Again, it is designed to create temporary blindness. So as you can see, it's hardly a new concept. There are two main concerns. The first is whether or not such weapons are lawful under the laws of warfare, which prohibit unusually painful weapons. Generally speaking, if they cause permanent blindness, they should be banned. Less permanent blindings are not so specifically prohibited. The other question is, well, if you know something's there, why not just shoot at it? I'm not going to say that it's absolutely not a force multiplier or that maybe they've come up with a derivation which other nations have not, but there is likely a reason why such systems, which have been around now for quite a few decades, have not entered widespread service. Masonic Rat. What is overmatching with regards to armor penetration? Well, in order for a saber round to get a kill, when it punches through the armor plate of the enemy, what actually causes the destruction is little pieces of metal which fly off both the steel armor and, to a large extent, the penetrator. There's also going to be a bit of the energy which is converted into heat. A combination of these things will result in a bad day for the personnel inside and any ammunition or fluids. However, fire the same round at a plywood target on the gunnery range. The penetrator basically remains untouched and a hole is punched in the wood. Some splinters will come out, but not much else. Basically, the penetrator went through like a hot knife through butter. So you can imagine what would happen if a penetrator designed to punch through 1.5 feet of armor impacts on something like an armored car. It'll punch a very neat hole on one side, fly straight through, not drag any metal with it, not change much energy into heat, and make a nice little neat hole out the other side. If it doesn't hit anything vital on the way through, you've overmatched. It's too much power for the effectiveness on target. For such targets, you're better off using either smaller rounds like a caliber 50 or a chemical effect round. Masonic Rat, who says that he recently watched Pentagon Wars, thought it was funny, government procurement is his personal hell as a JO, and is curious about how the Bradley came to be. Would I be able to describe Bradley's development? Yes, and that's likely going to be a topic for another video. However, as a teaser, I would direct you to my video on what Pentagon Wars got right. It is in no way a coverage of Bradley's development, but it is a teaser for some of the stages along the way. Joshua Nichols. Don't think I've seen this pop up. In the movie Fury, when both the PaK-40s and Tiger fire their shells, they have a distinct whistle as they pass. Is this accurate? Not having ever been shot at by a PaK-40 or a KWK-36, I can't tell for sure. However, I have an extremely strong suspicion that it would actually sound like a crack, basically the sonic boom. Bruni, with the mainstreaming of autoloaders, do you think we would see a new tank design one day with twin cannons fed by autoloaders? It could be a massive and beneficial increase in firepower. I don't think so. We're already looking at autoloaders which reload in 4 seconds and less. At this point, we're getting to the point that not loading is the delaying factor as much as the entire rest of the engagement cycle. Now, that's not to say that twin barrel systems aren't a thing. Despite the old VT1s, look at the Amos 120mm mortar. But indirect is a little bit special because you want to have as many impacts as quickly as possible. After the first couple of rounds go off, most folks will have made it to cover. And for the sake of flinging high explosive around, the more the better. There isn't really any practical advantage to being able to fire 2 rounds Sabo in 1 second at the cost of the weight and space taken up by a second system. Besides, modern tanks only carry about 45 rounds or so anyway. How quickly do you want them to run out? Joe Holloway, what was the Chimera? Was it a Stug, an S-tank, or something else? I've only seen it in Wargame Red Dragon. Okay, before anybody tells you to go look at the Armoured Archives video on Chimera, that is a different Chimera. The one in Wargame is a Canadian vehicle, quote unquote. However, it turns out that the same chap, Ed, has also done an article over on Tanks Encyclopedia. I've linked to it below. Of interest, one of the chaps who worked on the project chimed in on the comments section, and it explains how what was actually a British project ended up being considered Canadian in the computer game. It does not explain why some imagery shows only 6 wheels per side, however, when the text and the model indicate originally 7. Anyway, I cannot add to the article. I haven't seen anything, so I am just going to leave you off in that direction. Colonel Chang, I think it is fair to say that the Japanese have no qualms about licensing and adapting US technology for local use, which has resulted in a number of Japanese systems being quite similar to the US equivalents, from the F-15 variants to the F-16/F2 or the Congo-class destroyers to the early Burke. However, Japanese tanks are radically different to those of the US. What are the reasons for the significant divergence of Japanese MBT design to the US and other Western bloc nations? As an aside, how heavy and tall does a loader need to be to efficiently handle 120mm rounds? Well, the Japanese requirements are radically different. Water is basically water. It's generally flat, with few obstructions, so a ship's basically a ship. Fighters generally have similar requirements as there isn't much up in the sky to worry about. It's really just distances. Ground is a far more varied terrain. Japan is basically an archipelago, a bunch of islands. Some pretty big islands, mind, but equipment still needs to get from island to island and around those islands. Also, those islands tend to be a little bit more mountainous than the typical battlefield that US tanks were designed to operate in. Now that I think about it, I don't know if the rail system can handle MBTs with their 3-foot 6-inch gauge. And of course, Japanese people are a little bit smaller than their Western counterparts. So why create additional volume inside a tank to fit folks who aren't applicable? Look at the K1 versus the M1 over in Korea. So with a pretty narrow range of operation, basically Japan and its environments, the Japanese military could afford to design a tank specifically for operations in the Japanese area, whilst the US had to be a little bit more broad in the matter. It's a bit like why Merkava is such an odd design. It's designed solely to operate within conditions found within the 300-mile circle. As for the size of personnel to load rounds, it's not a matter of size as much as technique. A strong arm doesn't hurt, but it will be an unusually small and weak adult who can't handle a 50-pound shell once they figure out what they're doing. Jenny R. Given that in the US, modern armoured cavalry squadrons as currently being fielded differ from combined arms battalions only in relatively small ways, what is the opinion on the possibility of the formations becoming interchangeable? Do I believe that the German Panzer Grenadiers, being doctrinally something of a hybrid between mech infantry and cavalry by American reckoning, be an interesting model to adopt? Or do I think that it simply does not fit the way the US fights its wars? The US used to have a distinction between what the Germans consider panzer grenadiers and infantry troops. In World War II, they were armoured infantry branch but trained under armoured force for operations with armour units. In the later Cold War, the distinction was the 11 Mike MOS, Mech Infantry, versus the 11B, who were not so blessed with comfortable transportation. The elimination of the 11 Mike has led to some debate as to whether it was a good idea or not. Back in 2019, there was a proposal in Armour magazine to do exactly what you suggest. Create the 19 Mike MOS, thus placing Mech Infantry under the auspices of Armour branch, much as Panzer Grenadiers are considered Panzertruppen and not infantry. Obviously this hasn't gone anywhere, but there have been rumblings of infantry branch trying a bit of mechanized specialization. Can't say I've been particularly thrilled with what I've been hearing so far, but I'll wait until I see the final proposal, if it ever makes it out into the field. As for the other question, you might be confusing two different issues. When the Army created combined arms battalions, they basically took any unit that was going to be in a brigade, and if it was a cavalry squadron, such as in 1st Cav Division, it got to keep the name for lineage purposes, but was basically a combined arms battalion like any other. Similarly, the functions which used to be performed by an armoured cavalry regiment today are to be performed by a brigade combat team. It's argued whether it's a true successor, but anyway. However, the actual Cav squadrons which retain the cavalry role are not similar to the CABs. A current infantry CAB consists of 2 mech infantry companies and a tank company, with a mortar platoon and scout platoon at battalion level. A little light for a battalion if you ask me, but anyway. On the other hand, a cavalry squadron has mortars at the company level, 3 companies of recon Bradleys, 2 platoons each, and a company of tanks. As in older cavalry formations, it's a little bit heavy on firepower, a little light on dismounts. As a result, there very definitely is still a distinction in capability and role between a recon squadron and a combined arms battalion. For completeness, as of 2016, the CABs are now called armour and infantry battalions again, but the difference is just that they are 2 tank and 1 infantry, or 2 infantry and 1 tank company per battalion. Mike Quinton, for all our comments on the problems with Tigers and Panthers, weren't the generals and planners aware of these before the vehicles were deployed? Breakdowns, low mileage, weight and transportation issues were hardly a secret, and even a private could figure it out, yet they ploughed ahead. For Tigers, absolutely they realised there were limitations with the vehicles, and that's why they were designed as breakthrough vehicles, not standard tanks. Go to where they're needed, probably by rail, conduct the operation, then refit pending the next breakthrough requirement. The fact that they needed more man hours was reflected in the fact that whilst a typical medium tank battalion had a maintenance platoon, the heavy tank battalion had a maintenance company. Only once they started being misused did they really start having reliability problems. Panthers, that's a sort of. The vehicles were obviously rushed into production, and I'm sure everyone expected some form of teething trouble, though I'm not sure anybody expected them to be quite as bad as they were. The bigger problem with Panther though was that if you compare the specifications that MAN originally put forward with what was built in the end, you'll see a few extra tons were added over the probably underestimate originally proposed. So looking at Jensen Doyle's The Panther Tank, the verbiage is, quote, on 15th of May 1942, Oberst Fichtner, F-I-T-C-H-N-E-R, figure it out. This colonel telephoned MAN and informed them that Hitler had decided in favour of the MAN Panther and that series production has been ordered. The glacis plate was to be strengthened to 8 centimetres. There is no indication as to how Herr Hitler came to this decision. The submission put to him said 6 centimetres. However, that's kind of the thing with autocrat dictators. If they make a decision, you generally follow it. So even though, unlike Tiger, Panther was no longer within the boundaries of what the designers recommended, tough titty. The designers also apparently were not told to make the tanks idiot-proof for the benefit of the motor unskilled who had very little time to train before going to fight. Again, I'm sure someone in the pipeline realized that there was going to be a problem with under-trained troops operating highly complex and sensitive equipment. But what were they going to do? Have there been any generals alive to see the tank or AFV named after them? Not that I can think of. Bradley came close. He died just before the vehicle was named. I can't think of any in other countries either, now I think about it. I don't know who the Al Hussein was named after. Churchill's reaction seems to have been a bit mixed. Initially honoured and then a little bit irked after its combat debut was less than stellar. Quote, "That's the tank they named after me when they found out it was no good." Presumably his opinion changed again later. The other one which comes to mind is Harry Hopkins, but I have absolutely no idea what the man thought of it. If Churchill thought the infantry tank was no good, Hopkins must have been downright insulted, if anybody even told him about it. Christopher Ryan. Assuming that the logistics of charging and heat management could be reduced to match the current refueling and engine cooling capabilities of modern tanks, would a battery/electric armoured vehicle be better than a dino-powered one? Also, assuming the battery density has advanced to the point where range is not significantly degraded. Pure EV, no. Unless maybe you want to look at hydrogen as a fuel source. A refuel on the move is done in a matter of minutes. However long it takes you to get out of the tank, open the fuel filter port covers, put the fuel in, and they are bigger fuel nozzles than you find for your car. Close up and get going again. How can you do that with a rechargeable battery? You need to find some way of swapping out a charged battery for an empty one, kind of like the way Tesla advertised for their Model S. Note how, though, that never seems to have happened in practice. And I can't imagine it would be any easier in an armoured vehicle, let alone an armoured vehicle in the field. For hybrid systems, though, there may be promise. And this goes back to something akin to questions and answers number 1 or 2. Folks have been playing around with hybrid systems for a few years now, with a couple of miles of range on batteries for recon vehicles to allow them to sneak around even more sneakily, or just old school Porsche/Barnes type diesel electric transmission without any battery capacity. So far though, they've been looking at these solely for lighter vehicles. Nobody seems to have been interested in going back to an electric motor for a heavy tracked vehicle. Right. That is it for the Q&A. Apologies for the noises in the background, but again, you take the filming time when you can get it, and if there's noises in the background, sorry lads. Hope you found it interesting and informative. I'll talk to you on the next one.